to be here.
Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
Are we all good to go on broadcasting? Recording in process, and thank you to the team here at Water and Light that just addressed recent concerns that have come up about access to meetings and some reformatting on the website so that we have a Zoom link easily available for budget meetings, and YouTube links easily available for meetings that don't need public participation but are available in real time for viewing. So thank you for that quick work. Greatly appreciate it. And tonight's discussion, we're going to start with kind of a joint staff presentation. What I might ask is if it's feasible to kind of hold your answer or your questions rather and your answers until we get through the first part. You'll see on your agenda there's 3 bullet points, so we're going to pause before the 3rd bullet point and really go into Q&A right at that point. And we anticipate about an hour of staff presentation and about an hour of questions. Of course, if we need to stop and have questions that are relevant to the topic at the time, of course, we'll just adapt and go along with that. I so just wanted to say thank you to staff for putting together all of this, including Trina for going through the last commission meeting, listening for all the questions that were called out, and then the staff and their very thorough responsiveness and getting those questions answered and really queuing us up for a great discussion. So thank you to everybody. And with that, I think, John, are you going to set us up before Mark, or is...
I think we're going to start with Mark, and Trina has a presentation ready.
Great.
I believe.
Yeah. Sorry.
Does that look okay? I'm in the PDF version rather than PowerPoint because I'm not able to see Zoom if I'm fully in PowerPoint presentation. Is that big enough on screen?
Yeah, it works. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, everybody. We will do our best to present what we prepared and respond to questions. So the first thing that we were going to do is go through some revenue history for the water division. And what these graphs show are the budget to actual variance. Top line there, kind of the darker line, is actual for revenues and expenses, and then the lighter blue line is what we budget. So you can see, like in a perfect world, those would be like right on top of each other. We would be budgeting exactly what forecasting exactly what happens. You can see there's a wider variation on the revenues than the expenses. Our actuals, particularly over the last couple of years, have come in higher than what we budgeted. So there's more variation in the revenues and the expenses. And we've talked about this. That's in large part driven by some of the challenges that we had in our revenue forecasting with the summer heat wave a couple years ago and kind of transition in COVID. So anyway, and we actually were able to, when we did the budget, we didn't have 2023 numbers completed, 22-23 numbers. We do now with the close of June revenues just a week or so ago. So we were able to update that, and we actually, as you can see on the revenue graph there, or budget to actual graph, that we came in better than we budgeted by about 379,000, which is good. Maybe Trina, why don't you go to the next slide? So this shows our operating income. So this is basically revenues less expenses for operations. Gives us our budget and our actual. And again, you can see there's a lot of variation that happens you really see it show up in the operating income. So we've had higher income the last few years than we budgeted. And again, this goes only through 21, 22, because even though we have revenues for 22, 23, we don't have expenses yet. We won't have those for another month and a half or so while we're working to close everything out for the year. So we weren't able to show what our actual is for 22, 23 at this point. So why don't you go to the next slide, Trina? So one thing we thought would be interesting to show is so we show our operating expenses by financial statement category. There's a lot of detail in the budget. We thought we'd group them kind of by the larger categories. Labor obviously is largest. That's about 50% of the budget. Depreciation is next, 28%. And then insurance, and then our city water charge elimination, chemicals for the treatment plant, and then a whole laundry list of other expenses that we just kind of grouped together. So that's expenses, and that's the average over the last 3 years. So 21, 22 actual, our estimate for 22, 23, and then our budget for 23, 24. So, but we thought it would be helpful just to provide kind of a snapshot of what makes up the operating budget. The big driver in the water division is labor. Light looks different because of the purchase power and transmission that causes all other expenses to be dwarfed. Since those two total about 3% of the budget. Yeah. So, so why don't you go to the next slide, Trina? So for our forecasting process that we go through, so each year, I'll go through and look at water revenue in each type of, like residential, general service, all the different types of revenue are estimated individually by their groups, and I look at historical actuals for each of those revenue types. And so what I'll do is I'll look at the current year that we're in and we're budgeting. So when I did the budget this year, I was looking at 22, 23 numbers, and I have the first 9 months of the year actual. And then I'll estimate the last 3. And I look at our historical kind of what we collect in the first 9 months versus what we collect at the end of the year, the last 3 months. For residential, that's about 76% we collect in the first 9 months, and 24% the last 3. Now with COVID and with the heat wave that we had a couple of years ago, that threw 21 and 22 kind of off. Those percentages don't line up that way. But for the others, they're pretty tight for residential. For general service, it's a little different. There's a little more variation, but the average is close to that. It's like 77%, I think, for what we collect in the first 9 months for general service, and 23% for the last 3. So based on that, you can with some confidence, you can predict what your last 3 months are going to be based on what you've collected in the first 9. And then once we have the current year, then we'll project out estimate the budget year that we budgeted for this year, 23, 24. We don't have any actual numbers yet. We won't. So we just use 22, 23 numbers, the estimate, and then I'll look at some things that would maybe affect that number next year. So we look at the weather forecast. The state issues a summer forecast, and we'll compare that to the prior year. Look at potential changes maybe in water sales. Like this year, we knew we weren't going to have Carlton as part of our water revenues this year, so we took that out. There's sometimes other factors, maybe a large user we know is going to be down for a period of time, we'll adjust our revenues accordingly. So we'll take as much as we can anticipate about next year and sort of plug that into this year's kind of estimated actual for next year. That's so we look at we start with our current year, what we estimate as our actual, we plug in these other factors and use that for our estimate for the following year budget.
But it's fair to say that most of that variation is in the summer months, right?
Yeah, in fact, this year, we had for the summer. I'm sorry, for the summer months. There's typically it kind of starts in May, but generally it's June when you really see it kind of kick in, and it'll last typically 3 months, sometimes 4. Sometimes it'll go into September, but it's kind of tailing off in September. But that's where the high consumption is. This year, we actually generated more revenue in June than we did during the heat wave in June, which is surprising because you look outside and it's not we don't have anywhere near the temperatures we did, but we also are running lower precipitation. So, so it's just, it's a challenge to forecast. It's the weather really does impact things. So, and I still am not 100% feeling like I have a baseline like we used to have pre-COVID. I don't know if there's just, if the world's shifted, more people are just staying at home, working at home, and just using more water. Residential continues to just turn in higher consumption and higher revenue than what it used to prior to COVID. So,
is that an industry standard? Are you hearing that across other
I
organizations?
haven't compared that. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
If people are staying at home, working remotely, then they're using your facilities, right?
Yeah.
Much more than early morning and evening. So I mean, that's gotta be part of it.
And they're watering their lawns while they're checking email.
Yeah.
Or whatever. They're watering or whatever. Their new hydrangeas.
Yeah, I think it would be important, though, not to use anecdotal assumptions that if there's some, like you said, you don't have a consistent baseline. I know we're not asking questions like that.
It's okay. We all did it. Oh, we didn't all do it.
But-
Good job, you two.
Historically, it's fair to say that most of our revenue generated from water sales is in the summer.
Right, right.
And so that's the variable we have, is that summer, what the summer does, what it's shaping up to be.
The 379-ish thousand that we did better for our budget to actual for water revenues was largely generated in June. So, next slide, Trina. So, just as staff, we've discussed, ways that we could conceive of potentially increasing our water revenues. Certainly, rates affect that. If rates were to increase, that generates more revenue. Timber sales. So we have not used timber sales over the last few years for operations. If we were to do that, you don't actually show it that way timber sales are other revenues, so it wouldn't directly result in an increase in operating revenues. But if there was a conscious decision to subsidize operations through timber sales, that would be another way. And then certainly outside water sales, outside the city, that's another way. So that's I think where I have where my section stops.
Great, and I thank you. I think, and I think John and Trina are going to pick it up from there.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So my first one is your revenue budget actual and your operating income budget actual. Does that reflect the rate increases that I think are not shown in the budget because they happen after.
Yeah, right. We don't put the rate increase in the budget document. So those numbers do not include the rate increase.
Okay, okay. And second, to your last point, I would encourage us not to subsidize operating costs with timber revenue. And the reason for that is, one, it's, once you start there, it's hard to get off of it. It's hard to kick that. And second, we already have that money committed and then some for all these major capital improvements we have. And I think we should keep an eye on them.
Any other questions for Mark before we go into the next section?
Could we go back to the slide, maybe 3 or 4 back? We talk about the revenue, about the first 9 months, 75% of the revenue comes. And so just curious, if you look at those numbers, I mean, it's like revenue is flat every month, very consistent. If each quarter is about 25% of the,
Yeah.
which is kind of fascinating because it doesn't take into account maybe that summer peak or maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have a lull in the center. So your peaks are kind of on the ends.
Sure.
So the peaks are split, and that's why you end up with the 75-25, roughly 76-24. So
When I leave the office, I'm going to Lafayette, turn on 19th, and it's interesting to go down 19th Street and watch people with their yards. And there are people that have irrigation systems and those that don't. And having traveled that for years, I know who's got the garden hose and stuff. I saw a lady out with a weed eater cutting her dandelions on Sunday. And it just, I mean, people have chosen they're not going to water the yards. And I just see lots of brown. These are homes that have been there since the 70s.
Mhm.
It's just kind of fascinating to walk different neighbors and neighborhoods and stuff. And newer homes are going to have irrigation systems, so those grasses tend to be green and stuff. And others that have drag those out traditionally, I don't think you're doing it. Just happy with the with the Arizona look to their yard.
And I've talked to people who are concerned that there isn't enough water. They feel like they read about Arizona or they read about California, and they're concerned that they shouldn't be wasting water by watering around here, which is not at this point. I mean, it may become true later, but it's not true.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next section.
Sure, Trina, you got the start off?
Yeah. Sure. I was going to talk just a little bit about rates. When staff got together, we thought we would give kind of a 10-year snapshot of the rate increases over the years. One interesting thing that we found as we looked back was clear back to 2012 up to 2018, we had no rate increases on the water side at all. We didn't do a cost of service or have rate increases. Starting in October of 2018 forward, you'll see there was a 3% increase each year for about 4 years there. And then last year, when we did a cost of service study, the result of that came out at a 2% overall increase. Another interesting thing that we found was the meter charge. So the dollar amounts I have listed there are for your basic residential meter, 5/8 or 3/4. Those cost the same now. We've merged those two together. So over 10 years of increases, we only had about 5 years where the price went up, but over 10 years, that minimum customer charge only increased just over $2 in that time. So very minimal impacts to those meter charges, which then in turn does have an impact on the revenue. As we were also looking ahead to rate increases coming in the future, as I said, we did implement year 1 of a 4-year rate track in 2022. So we did the 2% overall increase the commission did. The plan was to recommend another 2% increase in 2023, but because of the results of this year's budget and a couple of the outlying factors that Mark has already talked about, we did ask the consultant, UFS, to take another look at the rate track and cost of service analysis, plug in the new budget numbers, and bring a new recommendation forward to the commission this fall. So the commission will be seeing an updated rate track and new recommendation that will be different from the 2% rate increase that you saw in the results last year in the cost of service analysis. We're looking at maybe recommending that the commission approve cost of service analysis a little more frequently for water now. Historically, we've either gone without doing them or doing them every 4 or 5 years, because water has been our steady division, not a lot of changes, not a lot of impacts, but with all of the changes in costs, the changes in capital projects, and the other factors, we think it might be a better idea to keep a little tighter look at it every other year. So we would do an electric cost of service 1 year, and the following year we would do water. And by looking at it every other year, we'd be able to just not have those rate shocks for the customers, and also to be able to meet the needs of our operations. Other items to consider are possibly looking at the customer charge a little closer. As I mentioned, we only had $2 increase over 10 years. That's kind of a steady revenue flow for the most part. And if we look closer at how do we increase that while not, adversely impacting the customers over the consumption charge that kind of ebbs and flows with the seasons, that would be more of a constant revenue stream for the utility. Also, a possibility is potentially adding a third tier in the consumption charge. That would definitely have a bigger impact on our high users, but that would be an option. And also, do we look at moving the effective dates of the rate changes so that maybe more of that revenue could be figured into the budgets as they're being prepared? Do we align that effective date with a fiscal year so that an entire 12 months of the fiscal year would be captured? Or do we look at doing it in January when consumption is usually at its lowest? You try not to implement rate increases at the height of usage. So for water, that would be in June or July when summer and temperatures drive water usage up. And for electric, that's going to be in the winter time because we are definitely a winter peaking utility. So items to consider there for budget considerations. Also wanted to give you a couple snapshots on timber sales. This chart should look familiar. It's something that Brent reports on from Mason, Bruce, and Gerard each year when he gives his annual report. You can see the fluctuations in harvest over the years, but you'll see kind of in the last 3 or 4 years, our sustainable yield is at about 4.75 million board feet, and we've been pretty well under that. A couple of years, it's been 3/4 to almost 1 million board feet underneath of our sustainable yield. So whether we wanted to commit revenue to any operations or want to keep it reserved for capital, I think there are needs in both areas if we wanted to boost those sales at all in the future, if the commission was interested in that. And this is just another snapshot of what our revenues have been over the last, I think he has 20 years listed there. So the median revenue is right about $2.8 million. I think we might even be a little bit under that for this year. I think we're at 1.8 for one of our sales and at about 800,000 for the other sale for this year. So I believe we'll be at 2.6, 2.7. And then John, I think you were gonna take this slide.
So one of the thoughts how do we increase water sales to small cities? I mean, we have water. That would be one of the other questions is how do we do that? There really hasn't been a lot of interest from those entities, but I know some of them are facing challenges. So how do we do that? How do we get them on board? Right now we're at 1.5 times for the city of Lafayette, but is there a way we can maybe do something different? So that's one of the questions want to pose to the commission as well.
It's a really interesting dilemma. I mean, I've done the what, 20 years been doing this. And we went from having cities sit here at the table and say, we want your water, but then you say, well,
I'm not willing to pay.
absolutely. And then talk to them about getting your rates in line and stuff. And then they, as we watched them. So we had Dayton with us at one time and something happened.
City council changed.
Yeah, and it was a political thing rather than, which I mean, the city manager at Lafayette really was our biggest proponent, saying everybody's making a mistake by not taking advantage of this. And so we struck out there and we're connected to them indirectly when you think about the piping system. So it's really a slam dunk. The same thing with Carleton. We're no longer supplying them, and I mean, long range, we can't get any information really about what's going on with the dam and stuff. And and those were our two best because we were connected. We have other people that want it, but they are so far off the, now maybe we have to finance some of those things, which we certainly have resources. We could do that like we did with Lafayette, but I guess sitting here in 2023, thinking about 1990, 2000, and we don't hear the complaints like we had been. I mean,
well, and like in Yamhill County, most groundwater is fully appropriated. So you've got these smaller cities that are on wells, and what are they trying to do? Rehab the wells instead of looking at it in a bigger picture and saying, hey, we need to think about this differently. And that's where I think we end up struggling is, and we get that.
We have really approached all these in a very, we've approached all these cities in a very genteel. I mean, we're here to help and, and open our books to, this is what we're doing to cover this. And we've got to get some of this money back. And it's just, but I think, John, until there's a crisis, they're not going to come knocking us. And it's when the state shuts their well down because of coliform or something.
Or, a lot of the wells don't produce much, and so
Or
naturally they just
go.
Do you know how each city is getting its water? I mean, I know Yamhill was largely on wells, but now they're hooking up with North Plains or.
Well, Yamhill had their own small reservoir, and now they're going with Hillsborough that joined that. And then Carleton has their reservoir.
That
Dayton
needs a major improvement.
Well, they just did that, so they're back online.
We're not sure how successful that's been. We can't quite get the good information.
Lafayette has springs, Dayton has springs, and they both have wells. And I know that Lafayette and Dayton have a joint well field. And I know they have issues with I think 2 of the wells are down right now. So
Dayton's dependent upon that.
Yep.
It's at the airport, and Lafayette's tickled to death.
Amity has a small treatment plant on I think it's the south of
Salt Creek.
Yeah.
And Sheridan has too much water and Willamina doesn't have any.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if, I know we're not.
No, we are.
Right, okay. So instead of waiting for them to come to us, if we're more proactive, and I'm thinking in taking an educational role in this, that this is our capacity, and here are some successful projects that we are working on with cities. Because an emergency, they're not going to know who to call. If we build trust and we take a proactive approach, I think there's value in that, because I think if you go to a city today and say, we're here to sell you some water, I'm not sure that's going to happen, right? But if you become a resource to them when the time comes, it might make sense.
We had done a lot of that with the county.
Yeah.
Because they had
Organized all that.
They had all that organized, and it constantly is changing with different commissioner every time.
Well, I think, one of the questions is, does the commission want to pursue increased water sales first before the how? It's the if.
Previous commissions have said yes.
Except, I think it's important that we take the long view here. Because at some point, we do not want to displace our water from up on the Coast Range with higher cost Willamette water for ourselves. It's not fair to our ratepayers. And so I'm concerned that if we make deals now that have this at a lower price, or that encourage people to, get on our system because we have plenty of water, when it comes time to change them to selling them water from the Willamette, that's going to be a lot more expensive. We're going to have a very hard time of it. So I'm not that excited about trying to either cut our prices or encourage people to buy more of our water now without them understanding that this is temporary and it's our ratepayers who are going to have the Coast Range water. When
I would never imply that we would be cutting the rates, right? Or that we would be selling water that isn't advantageous for this enterprise. It's that we're offering an option to cities, and we make sure that it's recovering and exceeding. We charge a rate that makes sense and that is not going to put them in an awkward position when the price goes up, right? We build all of that into the contractual relationship. But I think you're right, is that I think we shouldn't take things off the table because we're still in exploratory state right now. And so I think this is an interesting option.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting option. I also know there's some other things staff's gonna discuss so that we have a larger body of kind of tokens to discuss, then we might not need to drill as deep.
Okay, and real quickly though, Jody, the other cities have historically had a hard time seeing it's got to work for both of us. And so what I'm concerned is if we open this up, they're going to see it as it's going to make it a much more difficult negotiation. So what you're talking about doing, I think will make it much more difficult as opposed to them coming to see us. And I frankly think that Carlton knows we have water and that there's an easy way to get to it, and that Dayton probably does too.
Yeah, and Dayton's had changes in the city council too, so we
So
don't
it
know.
might be a new day.
Exactly.
One last thing, just to, we established the regional water system. And all three of us were members. It still sits today. It's, we've been meeting every other month, but then we've had trouble with getting Carlton participated here of late, and Dayton blew us off 4 or 5 years ago. So anyway, we have this mechanism in place of meeting every other month, and it's just interesting.
Should we go on before we
Yeah.
dig too much deeper?
Yep. Go ahead, Trina, or I guess it's Marcy's up.
So a few of the questions that were raised had to do with personnel expenditures. So I'm going to cover those 3 items. We'll talk a little bit about FTE and staffing levels, and then benefits as a percentage of wages, and then we'll see some comparisons to a few other utilities. So first, what I have here is a chart that shows our FTE count, and it's comparing our FTE count in 2013, so 10 years ago, compared to today. And I have staff put in 6 different groupings there. So the top 2 groupings are operations, the electric operations and the water operations, and then administration. Then the next one has 3 departments in it: customer service, finance, and IT. Next one has engineering, and then the bottom one has our purchasing, fleet, and facilities. So you can see that the number has changed by 2 FTE in those 10 years overall. As one can imagine, 10 years has gone by. We haven't just added 2 FTE. We've changed positions. We've gotten rid of some positions. We've added positions, but the net effect is the 2 FTE. In reality, we've changed about a quarter of our positions from one thing to another. For an example, back in 2013, we didn't have a person with the HR manager title. We had somebody else who did the HR role plus the clerk role, plus the admin for the general manager role. So
The
positions
attorney
that,
was a contract,
what was that?
the attorney was a contract job.
Yeah. So a lot of changes in those 10 years, but the net effect is 2 positions. So we do a couple some things here that do help us with our staffing levels. So I wanted to point out those. So one thing that we do is when we have a position that's going to open up, or we have a need for a position, or we see a retirement on the horizon, we evaluate that position. So we ask a bunch of questions. Do we need it? Do we need that position? There's someone else who can do it. Can we divide it up among other people? Are there tasks that position does that they no longer need to be doing? Things like that. We evaluate positions most every time when we see something changing. We also do reorganizations of departments, and we successfully did a couple last year that were pretty major. So we did reorganize our electric department, our line department, and our engineering departments last year. And it was a major change, but it put us in a better position to do work here. Other things that help to keep those staffing levels low are technology, and then also process improvements. John is really big on looking at our processes and seeing if there's an easier way to do it that takes less manpower, things like that. And of course, we see at the bottom there, our meter count has increased by about 10% over time. So as we add more people, we do wonder, when is that time when we need to add a new water crew, add a new line crew? When will that be? And then regulation brings about a lot more need for staffing, and we've talked a little bit about our succession planning needs and how we'll need to overlap positions from time to time to give people time before the person leaves to learn those roles. And then the other one I wrote down was that as we do strategic planning, there may be needs for staffing in some of that work too.
I think one of the big areas that we're gonna seriously look at increasing is the electric operations because of electrification, which means that we're going to have to start increasing the capacity of our electric system. So new wire, new substations, new subdivision, going in and replacing transformers. Those things are gonna drive that department significantly, because the estimates I hear are somewhere between 2 and 3 times the size and in the capacity that we would need in our system.
One thing that we do say quite a bit is that we run lean. And I do think that is accurate. We're big enough to have some big needs, but we're still a small utility. So we have a lot of people that wear a lot of hats and do a lot of things outside of their job descriptions. Trina, ready for the next one?
Can I just comment?
Yeah.
I don't know if you had a chance to go back towards 2000 and look at, I'm thinking 59 or
We'll
so.
go back to 1988. So in 1988, in your history book there,
Okay,
we moved into this facility. We had 8,000 electric customers and 5,000 water customers. Guess how many employees we have?
probably pushing 70,
60
60. Okay, see, I'm thinking
Interesting.
in 88.
in 1988. So 35 years ago.
that when you were handwriting every
Yeah.
invoice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
That's right,
yeah,
yeah.
books, the actual books that were the,
Troop 4, remember that?
I remember that.
So I think it's very important that the commission asks this question. And I think I, as one commissioner, am very pleased with the answer that you guys really are running an efficient ship here. And I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, next.
Good guy.
So I heard the question asked during that last commission meeting, what are benefits as a percentage of total wages? So that's what this chart is reflecting. And we'll go down it, and this slide and the next slide use the same data, but they show the results in different ways. So what we have here on the top are the 2 rows of wages. So premium wages, what I have in there is I have overtime and I have standby pay. And then everything else I've put into regular wages. So this is this year that's just ended, $6.5 million for our wages. Then down below are our benefits. So we are part of PERS. That does have a good percentage to it, tied to it. So we have 52 employees who are in the OPSRIP group, that's 22%. And then we have 13 employees in the tier 1 and tier 2 group, that's 25%. And then on top of that, we have the 6% for the IAP. So a lot of money going into that PERS group. Health insurance, that we haven't had a rate increase in health insurance for the past 3 years. We actually had some decreases. We had a decrease in our dental coverage. We had a decrease in our life and disability, even though that's a different row. The health insurance is going to increase here January 1st, 5%. See that. Next row is taxes and workers' comp, and I think I have some minor extra things that didn't add up to much that I put in there. Post-retirement medical, we do have a small list of employees who have retired, and we are paying their medical insurance. Last year, that number was 70,000, so it's dropped quite significantly. We had a plan that paid for retirement for retirees, and it ended somewhere around 2004, 2005. But we do have another 12 people who are going to qualify for that insurance when they retire, likely.
But eventually that's gonna go away,
Eventually, it'll
unless
go
we
away.
negotiate something different or
Yeah.
something.
That's right. So all those things together are the $3.6 million. And so that percentage, 56% there on this side, that is saying that the $3.6 million is 56% of the $6.5 million. So it's comparing it to the wages. Total is 10 million, and Trina will go to the next one. So this one is a little bit different, but this is usually what I'm seeing in different documents, this total compensation. So what this chart answers is what percentage of the total compensation is wages, or is PERS, or is health insurance. So this is looking at that $10 million and asking what percentage is wages. So that's what you have here. They're the same groups, or the same categories and everything like that, same amount, same year, everything. But then you can look over to the side and you can see some comparisons. I looked for utilities, and I looked for utilities that have PERS. And so all of these, I do have City of McMinnville in there as a reference. I did model my chart after City of McMinnville's in their budget, but so those are utilities that have PERS, and that's where we sit compared to them. I tried to find Springfield's the other one that's similar to us, and couldn't capture those numbers, but
Do they all use the payroll costs as as you have instead of up with the wages? So their
Do they-
format is exactly like ours. You've got payroll
It's
costs
very-
down in that.
it's very similar.
Okay.
Yeah, these were all pretty similar to,
Okay.
and a couple of them had
And
that
that only amounts to
chart
like
and everything.
a percent anyway, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. We're right on top of UM.
In UWeb, I would say they have about 100,000 customers. But they have like 530 employees. It's like,
Yeah.
It's crazy,
Yeah, how many customers?
like 100,000,
And then
530, 520 employees.
But they do more things than we do too, right? They do generation.
They do some generation, yes,
Wheeling.
A lot of fiber,
some
Right.
fiber. I
a
think.
lot of fiber.
Yeah. But so, that's, and then there's Canby, which is much smaller than us. But Canby, eWeb, McMinnville and Springfield are all very similar utilities because we both have water and electric. And so we have very similar governance structures too. And so those are the 4 utilities that are in Oregon.
Canby and Forest Grove City Council.
No, Canby is like us.
They have,
Okay,
okay,
I thought
after the default,
They have their own board.
okay,
eWeb, McMinnville, Springfield, and Canby all have their own utility boards.
okay.
And so just another comment on benefits, we just another reminder that we do have a lot of skilled labor needs here, and so we are often competing with others around us who are after those same people. We do have some people in this town that are working for
Other utilities?
Twelson Valley and working for Hillsborough, other utilities that are around us, and so that's always interesting when you figure that one out. And so we do have similar benefits to everybody. Everybody seems to have those same benefits. Most people are with CIS. Most people are offering an Aviva these days. Very, very similar benefits, but that's we try and stay as competitive as we can. And one thing that we do have here that we probably have in other areas too, but is a challenging housing market.
thank you.
Nice, thank
you.
I think
Good information.
pretty close to being on time.
Yeah. That's the
That's-
end of
that's
the
the end.
session. So great. So I think what would be great to do now is just kind of go through the commission. Get some general thoughts, maybe some questions called out that we might want to have answered to bring back, and then kind of dive into discussion, but just give everybody a chance to kind of flush through their notes and put stuff out without going too deep. I heard 3 questions. I heard some of these questions. I have some of these questions that I would love follow up on. One was Jody's question: is water consumption up across the industry? That would be really interesting to know. I have a follow-up question, kind of conversely of the conversation that was happening at the table, which is, could we do SDCs on out of McMinnville hookups only or extensions? So as opposed to the idea of discounting, that would actually be a revenue generator, but not on our citizenry, or not on our customers. And then I would be interested in knowing the water rate comparison with other cities, comparable size and maybe comparable sources, if that's possible.
We have that chart. We have a chart we put together every.
So those are my 3
Yeah,
questions.
sure.
My 2 other notes are, one, that I wouldn't, I am supportive of doing the cost of service evaluation every other year and alternating water and electric. I thought that was a great idea. I couldn't see getting really supportive of increasing customer charges. I think it would have an especially negative impact on multifamily. And so it would be adversely really impacting our lower income, most low income families. Those are my questions and thoughts that I feel I want to call out. Commissioner Christensen, do you have questions or thoughts you want to call out here initially?
Well, the only other thought I have, which I appreciate all of the recommendations that were presented, is there an ability for this enterprise to look at federal and state grants to cover some of the expenses that may be incurred, particularly with the infrastructure money that's coming into the state.
Yeah, we've talked about that, but that would be more towards the capital side, not the operating side.
That's true.
And so that was one of the things, you know, we got some ARPA funding from the county. For both the raw water line and the transmission main, right? And the emergency filtration trailer. So we received about $550,000 in grant funding there, but I think to go to your question, yes, we want to look at potential grants for the capital improvements.
Yeah. And then the only other thing is, and I appreciate Commissioner Tankersley about not subsidizing using the timber funds, but I think we need to leave all options on the table as we
Well,
move it through.
so I guess one of the questions would be, do we try to get the timber harvest closer to the sustainable yield on a regular basis?
Part of the problem there is he's picked out
Right, going around.
chunks
so it
of,
might be a little
yeah,
hard.
I mean.
But I think if you
the
look at
function
it,
yeah,
but maybe you look at it from an averaging point,
yes.
you know, maybe one year you're a little bit higher, but the next year you're a little lower,
Mhm.
so. But the average is higher, is closer to that number.
You know, I brought up the timber sales last time, just as a shot in the arm. You know, the last thing a business wants to do is start selling its assets to fund its operating problems. So I guess I'm really more looking forward to Wednesday to think about, okay, so let's say we lose money this year, we lose money next year. How can we stop doing that? And, you know, we bite the bullet for 2 years and we're able to get back on the path. So I think that's more what I'm leaning towards. You know, we're pretty lean to begin with. The repairs that we make in the system they happen, we got to take care of them, those kinds of expenses. And, you know,
And that's the other thing we need to remember is if we're not doing the regular, going back to Jody's point, if we're not doing the infrastructure work, and it ends up becoming into maintenance, this is going to drive our problem even worse.
Sure.
So.
Any comments, Commissioner or Chair Tankersley?
Yeah, so on the grant funding, I think we can actually maybe use some grant funding to lower our operating expenses. And the thought I had was, you know, we had talked about the possibility, and I think we are looking at this already, putting in a wind turbine or some
Mhm.
water
Yep.
to provide power to the treatment plant, which would actually reduce the cost of running the treatment plant.
Yeah.
And if we can get grant funding for that capital expenditure, I think it'd be a good thing to do.
I was thinking about that as far as a revenue source for the water system, is if we could do something like that with the in-pipe turbines,
Right.
where you could actually put something in, generate revenue, and then electric system buys that as
Right.
revenue to the
Yeah,
water
we
system.
could do that, but I think we'd also look
Right.
at up at the treatment
Yeah.
plant, and that would reduce that expense. And then second, I like the idea of the sustainable yield and average it. I mean, Brent's talked about that for years, and we go, some years are higher, some years are lower. It looks like we just sort of
And I've been slowly going.
Yeah. away from it, yeah.
Great. And Commissioner Tate?
I feel like I have, I feel like a lot of my questions I have are just because I need more education and understanding about some things. So I might be way out in left field about some of my crazy thinking about some things, but and they're kind of all over the place. One thing I was looking at is I went back to some notes I had written like a year ago, and when we had a meeting in June, so I was probably talking about rates as well. And you had brought up something about our sort of our cash reserve policy. And there was a comment that, you know, if we don't have one, we should do it right now. And I frankly don't know, did we ever do that? Did we do anything with that? And and I think part of my thinking around that is like, is there money in the cash reserves that is being spent or earmarked for like repairs and maintenance versus like capital improvements? And could that revenue be shifted to the operations side if we were more aggressive about or more specific about how we earmarked that money?
So basically doing more capital to hopefully offset maintenance costs in the water system.
Well, that's one, I mean, that's one
Right.
one side of it, but the other side of it is there money being spent out of the cash reserves that, depending on what policy was, could be looked at more like an operational, like.
Are you
see what I'm
saying that because cash reserves aren't called out in the budget document, that all of those monies are really being evaluated as part of our operating budget when they shouldn't be? They should be frozen or separated out so that they're not accounted for,
I feel
or?
like all of that money is being pulled out of the operating budget and put into capital improvement buckets. Is that wrong?
Yeah, so I would, my take on it is if you're looking at cash reserves or cash for your operations and your capital, the only way you're going to affect your operating budget is by if you increase your spending on capital, when you're doing a lot of it with your staff, you're going to put more of their payroll expense in capital.
Right.
It's going to reduce your operating expense for payroll. So you would
Mark, can you come up to the table so we can hear you on the microphone, please?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
And start over from the beginning.
Yeah, so if in looking at your cash available for your operations and your capital, so we don't have a policy stated in our budget document, but all of our cash reserves we've looked at those as available to spend for operations or capital. And so when we do our budget, we look at our planned capital and we factor in labor and how much we anticipate we're going to spend. Our labor is going to be spent on capital projects because those labor costs become part of that capital, which is not an operating cost. It's a capital cost that goes on the balance sheet. So one way that you would affect if you plan to do more capital, then the result of that would be you would have less payroll expense hitting your operation. More of that would go to capital.
But
Right.
one of the reasons we're looking at this is because they're essentially saying that we're not generating enough income.
Mhm.
And so we can tell that because we're negative on our operating. And so we have to pull that out of cash reserves to make that difference.
Mhm. Yeah, our negative operating income is affecting it's reducing our operating cash or our cash reserve. What ultimately ends up is our ending cash. It reduces that, yeah.
And so, I think going back to Kathy's point earlier, when Mark Beauchamp does his cost of service, he always has what he feels should be our minimum cash on hand. And so maybe that's where you heard that. When he does those,
Yeah.
Okay.
because he has for both electric and water, he has a minimum, what he estimates should be our minimum cash for both electric and water, which I think is about, correct me if I'm wrong, Trina, 16 million for electric and about 9 million for water. Is that right?
Yeah, I can pull up the latest cost of service study that shows that too, if you like.
If Kathy wants.
Yeah, I'm already like over my head a little bit. I'm just trying to figure out like, so like the money for timber sales. So we have lots of capital projects and we have lots of money reserved for those capital projects, but but they're really expensive. And so they're like pushed out over a lot of years of doing maybe little bits and parts or trying to save enough money to be able to do the project. But my feelings are like every year we're seeing all of the price increases, go up so high that a project that we put on the books and budgeted and put a stake in the ground to save that money for, if we don't execute those projects in a shorter period of time, we just have to say, we have to get twice as much money to do the project. So I'm just trying to, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I
no,
think you
no.
know where I'm going.
I know,
but
yeah, I know exactly. And I was gonna, Trina, would you bring up the slides again and go back to the one that had the breakdown of the operating budget? Because I think part of what happens in there is we have yeah. So we have labor in there, right? And then the next biggest item is depreciation.
Mhm.
Well, where does that money go? The depreciation goes back into cash reserves, right? Mark? So in reality, what we're really spending is not $7.2 million. Because 2.2, a little over 2 million goes into reserves to cover the cost of future repairs or replacements. So, I mean, we get timber, plus we get that is also going into cash reserve. That's why if you look at our cash reserves, we spend $6 million in capital, but our cash reserves are still growing.
But they're not growing fast
But
enough to meet
that's
the cost.
the-
So,
The
Yeah.
bigger point.
yeah. And so then I guess when I look at like timber sales and I say like, and you say, save that for capital improvements, it's like, I feel like each year we're saving, we're
Losing.
losing.
Mhm.
And I know that this doesn't like directly affect our conversation today, but it does in the sense that how that money gets allocated and put into the books does have an impact. And we know that raising rates year after year is never going to catch up.
Yeah.
Like, we're never going to catch up. So just trying to thinking about the money we have differently, and maybe the changes aren't so much operationally, day-to-day operations as they are changing the scope of how we're thinking about doing projects. Because those things seem to have like a much larger impact on the bottom line of the budget, right?
Yeah, in the long run, yes, because, your maintenance costs are gonna go up if you don't fix those things
Right.
and replace them.
Right. Well, I think I'm just used to operating in a world where there was not, like, I was in a super competitive environment. So I didn't have the luxury of trying to just save all the money I could to finally do the thing I wanted to do, because by the time I got there, everyone else would have passed me by and I would be out of business, right? And so I didn't have any choice but to borrow money to execute as quickly as possible. But the upside of that was then I immediately had an asset that was worth a lot of money that I could then, depreciate, and there was a big benefit. And then I had to use my cash reserves, of course, to pay my debt services, but I grew at a much faster pace and I got a lot of projects done in a shorter period of time.
Commissioner, sorry, Ormley has a question, I think, on your.
I just want to comment on what you said. We 5 people have total control over what happens with that timber. And we have talked before about if we had something special and the prices were up, let's sell. So I mean, back to and the quickest way to solve the problem you're talking about is we have some bigger timber sales, allocate that cash to that particular project or something. The problem is do they have capacity for us to cut three times the amount of timber?
Well, and so one of the other things we were looking at as staff is, we have this pot of reserves. And how do we get more interest out of that? And looking at the investment part and being more aggressive in, not just putting in an LGIP and just letting it sit there. Okay,
Right.
can we get more money by investing in bonds? And that's what you're seeing. We're
Right.
trying to do that because right now bonds are 5.5%, LGIP is 4%.
Right.
So why wouldn't we do that?
Right, and that was, one of the things, I mean, looking at, where do we get more operating income? Or where do we get more revenues? I mean, revenues have been really large the
Right.
last year and a half, and that money is going only to capital improvements. And I know that I am absolutely sure we had some detailed discussion on what we were gonna do with that interest and why it was like that, but I don't have a clear recollection, and I'm wondering, that's a lot of money. I mean, it's $1 million, over $1 million, and is that something that, should be being thought about? And then, we've also are waiting for, I think, a appraisal on the property.
Yes, we're gonna
across
talk
the
about
street,
that
and
later this week.
I just, when we're thinking about raising rates, which we know is not long-term gonna ever completely get us out of where we are, it's like, where's other money sitting? And, is it working in our best interest to move us ahead on our capital projects and to also deal with the rate issue? So I don't know, just things I've been thinking about. I did have I'm sorry.
But going back, I was just
Mm-hmm.
gonna comment, going back to Remy's comment about SDCs, I mean, we'll have that discussion later in the
Yeah.
fall.
That's on my list too.
Because, we're gonna bring that back
Mhm.
and see what the commission wants to do with SDCs. That is another option for generating revenue for capital.
Yeah, and Trina was talking to me about that. I mean, the SDC's income that comes in is looked as a capital revenue coming in, but like to Trina's, Trina was reminding me, like, there's a lot of personnel salary associated with all of that as well, and then that would be taken out of the operating and put into the capital
Mhm.
budget, right? I mean, capital expenditure,
And
right?
yeah, and one of the things that we're a little bit unique about here is that we do quite a bit of work internally, which pulls money out of the operating budget and puts it into the capital.
Right.
So our crews, actually, crew of 5 does water main replacements every year.
Mhm.
Now, what's happening is the dollars have gone up so much, so fast in the cost of materials that now we can do less because there's a cap on that through the state when we'd have to actually go out to bid. And so what's happened is now instead of doing 11 or 1,200 feet, we're doing 700 feet.
It's so interesting.
So all of those things put constraints on us.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
Do you have more questions or items on your list?
I do.
Okay.
I'll just a couple other things. I think that one of the things on one of the slides was talking about the third tier consumption, and that has to do with our contract users, is that right?
We don't
Or-
have any contract users on water. It's just the bigger meter sizes.
The bigger meter sizes, okay. And so would that include, who would that be, like an example?
It could be Cascade Steel. It could be, any of the larger.
And so the contracts the agreements that we're currently operating with them on, could there be rate increases at that level for?
Because the ones you're thinking about are the electric side where we have a pass-through contract. The water, we don't have that pass-through.
Okay.
contract.
Okay, all right, yeah, so I mean, I really feel like that's important to look at, and I also wondered about talking about them shutting down for a couple months and how that has a significant hit on our revenue.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there's a way to minimize that ability, the ability for them to have such an impact, like, I don't know.
We've talked about this and we haven't come up with, this has been a conversation for years.
Mhm.
It has.
And how I mean, how,
What if?
yeah, exactly.
What
It's
if
the
we wake up
if,
tomorrow morning and
and
guess
they were
what?
gone.
Yeah.
I mean, it's could potentially be $1 million a year.
So
in
there's no like minimum commitment, purchase
No.
commitment, annual purchase commitment, or minimal notification, like time when decide they're gonna shut down their operations for some
Yeah.
period that, so we have like, just all of a sudden, it
Yeah.
just hits us, right?
But they do pay a meter charge,
They
right?
do pay a meter charge, but so that's why the commission in the last contract, I guess it was 2010 or 11, went to, on the electric side, went to the pass-through contract because
Mhm.
it took the risk
Right.
off of us.
Yes, yes.
I will add, though, that we are in constant contact with that customer about what's
yeah.
going on with their market, and
Oh, yeah,
so we'll be the first to ever know that there's a problem.
right.
I mean,
And we
they've been that,
actually-
that's our relationship with it.
Well, and we also do an annual financial review on them as well, because that's part of our
Right,
electric. bill.
right, we talked about that.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there's a way to stabilize that, so it's not quite
Yeah.
such a.
I might add that part of what happens in the cost of service is they'll look at, UFS has looked at major customers and the impact if they were to cease operations for buying water. And so that's part of that reserve that he looks at for kind of a minimum reserve.
Okay.
But so that factors in, and basically what that does is that gives you time where you would ultimately have to use some reserves to adjust to not having that revenue. You're gonna have to either cut your operation expenses, or you're gonna have to generate additional revenue to fill that gap.
Mhm.
So you're gonna need time to do one or both of those. So anyway.
Yeah. I just have one more thing, I guess, that I've been thinking about, and that is like, I thought it was really interesting in the history book, like. I didn't write down what year it was, but at one point there was water charges that were broken down by like your bathtub and your toilet. And whether you had used a hose or not,
Yeah.
and I don't know how they were able to collect that data, which is one toilet or two, which is pretty interesting, but it was like 25 cents if you add another toilet. But I do feel like, while McMinnville Water and Light is not in the position of having to worry of whether people water their lawns or not, and we won't be probably for a long time. I guess I don't feel like it puts, for me personally, I don't feel like it puts us in a place where we shouldn't be thinking about how we use resources and how we set an example for how we value resources, which is what, has happened for all of these years, is that the water source has been a cherished commodity and very highly protected by the city. And I guess I'm just saying that as part of this whole process, I think it's important to think about how we use water, and important to communicate with our customers about how they're using water, and decide if some point, just because we don't have to do it, doesn't mean we shouldn't consider doing it, which is to talk about how people, pay more if they don't want to get on the conservation wagon, if they don't want to be a part of that process.
And that was a reason that we changed from the timber revenues subsidizing the water
Mhm.
to actually charging what it costs to produce it. It seemed like we were sending
On
a
that
price signal that said wastewater.
Mhm.
And that's the
decades.
other reason you look at doing tiered rates and
Mhm.
making those higher tiers
Mhm.
more expensive, is to
Mhm.
make people think about using the water. When you get up into those tiers, it gets that expense, and maybe I need to cut back and look at using water more efficiently.
Yeah, I have a son that lives in New York, and he has a lot of thoughts about a lot of things, but whenever I talk to him, he thinks it's very ironic that I have anything to do with water and light, and that I live on a golf course. And he thinks that I should move immediately, and he's very appalled by that. So I don't know what to tell him. Look, we have a lot of water, but it's not a good answer. So anyway,
I will tell you, the golf course does not like to buy water from the city of McMinnville. It's too expensive. Is there anywhere that, right now, we charge, we have hydrant charges? Do we have a monthly, just a standby charge on a fire sprinkler system?
Yes, we have for fire lines, yes. we
For
have a
fire lines,
line
okay.
charge.
have we ever, does anybody anywhere charge for flowing and stuff like that?
I mean, for the
Or
fire,
during a fire, even wasted water during testing and stuff?
I haven't found anybody, but I thought about that before.
So, you know, when you do the backflow reports, you always put down the bypass meter and what's going on with it and stuff. You know?
Well,
And you guys, I know you guys look at those. but-
yeah, but, okay, we had the fire at the creamery, 2.2 million gallons of water.
Yeah.
We got nothing.
Did you build the insurance company?
It's like, no, that's.
Because we don't, so I'm just, that's something else to look at. I mean.
Yeah.
Which is defies our history from going clear back to Oregon Mutual's founding, et cetera, you know. Do that, but I mean, another place
You know,
to
that's.
be interested around the country. Does anybody charge
Right,
more, you know?
for hydrant, for. Hydrant.
There's a bunch of water wasted testing the systems every year and stuff, you know?
Well, and that's the other thing I don't think people realize here. You know, the industry standard for water loss is 10%. And we're 5 to 6.
Wow.
And
But
so
we-
we're almost half of what the industry standard is, because we do go out. And then if we find something wrong, we go out and fix it right away. We don't wait. You know, we're not in that mode of just, not doing something because we don't have money to fix something. And so, to me, that's a really bad thing to be in, is, oh, well, let's let it flow because we don't have.
Yeah.
Manpower or resources to fix. No, that's the wrong approach.
So, Madam Mayor, just to add something you should be aware of is that for decades, we have offered our staff to all the small cities around, especially, we first looked at Lafayette. First thing we did was, well, listen, we got to get your system tighter. And so help them do that kind of stuff. But we've done that at Carlton. We've helped at Yamhill. I mean, that's, we've been very generous about trying to do that. Trying to help them. I mean, really, so that's something that you should feel good about.
I think on the last question around hydrant charges, I mean, I think looking at when you said waste a lot of water, I kind of look at water waste in a different way. I think testing an irrigation system or testing a hydrant, something where, you could inadvertently toxify the water system, or, you want to make sure you have a working system in place when you do have a fire. They might be high water usage. I don't look at that as waste as quite the same way as if you have sprinklers that, are halfway into the street
yeah.
and just going right
Right.
down into the sewer. To me, that's more of, regardless of your value system on what you should
Right.
water, what you shouldn't water. It's that, that there are, or the leaks that are allowed to exist in systems once they're off our system. I would say that those are very wasteful issues. And I think that type of historic approach of how do we tighten up these systems so we don't have that waste, I easily define that as waste.
What I was talking about was being able to generate money off the use of that water. We had to treat it.
Right. There's
Yeah,
chemicals.
yeah.
Yeah, we had to
Mhm.
clean the water. So yes.
All right, additional conversation.
So I guess what I would point is that Trina, you've got the minutes, you're taking notes. We'll come up with the list of questions and see if we can get answers to those and then come back to the commission.
Yeah, I don't, I would love to be reminded too of how the tiered rates play out into the system.
So right now we have 2 tiers. And the first tier is $1.67, Trina, is that correct? And the second tier is $2 and it's based on,
Yeah, the first 1,000 cubic feet is about $1.66 per 100 cubic feet, and then over 1,000 is $1.89 per cubic feet, rounding up.
And then but then there's also the third tier.
well, we don't have,
We don't have-
we would propose to put a third tier. And
Understood.
then you would have a higher rate in the third tier.
And how many of those customers that were discussed would fall into that? What would the cutoff be on water usage? Is that's the question
Yeah,
in front?
That
of
would be the
commission.
question is, and then we'd have to probably have our rate consultant do some type of analysis on.
course.
Yes.
We actually, over the years, looked at every commissioner's, remember we, in I pool, remember? Had the highest water use. So, yeah.
So that's, that's the thing that, that's another option that's out there. And the way you would probably do that is you would start it very close to the second tier. And then over time grow that so that it's not a huge impact right up front.
So mostly be focusing just on industrial
It'd be the
customers.
large commercial and industrial.
Large commercial.
What's the process
Give me
to
one
water
second.
part tier?
Water. What's that?
I just asked and answered, what was the process? And he said right here.
But for use, I mean, when they do the cost of service analysis, when they show us that, will we be able to see revenue generation from usage versus meter?
The charge, yeah, we should have that broken out. Separate.
Because I'm questioning, I mean, it all sounds great, but it's like how much can you really generate off of usage? How big do those numbers have to be to really make a substantial impact?
Well, did we have, I think we have it broken down, don't we, Mark, on here?
This slide wasn't shown, I can hand that, or actually.
Because I think that, when Trina was talking to me today, she reminded me, some of our issues are some ups and downs of money, being able to depend on what the revenue is gonna be, and if it was associated with the meter, then you can count on that, and
Right.
that's something you can build on. If it's associated
I
with
think-
usage, it's like, we're back to the steel mill scenario or
Mhm.
hot weather or, other seasons, so we can look at building up the budget, but it has to be, can we count on it, right?
I think the meter charges was about $2 million of the revenue. Is that correct, Trina, if I remember right?
I don't have that number right off the top of my head. We'd
It
have to
was,
look
it
at
was
it.
one of the slides I sent you.
Let me reshare here.
I think I printed that one.
One of the ones in the presentation, Mark.
No, it was one that I emailed to you.
Oh,
Guys share this slide deck with us too after
want
the
it?
meeting?
You want to print it or email?
No, just email's good.
This presentation, we have emails.
Okay,
I'm always asking what I saw and I look all over for it and
I would love to know some cost estimates on that turbine power into the water system, whether it's looking at. Feeding the treatment plant. I mean, is there, I mean, I love that philosophically. I don't know if money wise it is
winner or lose.
oh, yeah.
Not that one, Trina. It's the one that,
What's that?
it's the one that has a bar graph.
We do, but we were actually. So going back to Remy's question, that's going to be part of the IRP that we're looking at is what resources we might be able to have. And one of the ones I was looking at is actually the finished water because we get more pressure there. Because places were up to 250 pounds.
Yeah, that's the turbine in the pipe, but
Yeah,
there's also
turbine.
the wind turbine.
Right. There's both.
Yeah.
So we're gonna look at both of those items. So that's one of the things I wanted to do, because the problem is on the electric side, at some point, we won't have any growth in the energy side. We'll have to figure that out on our own, because Bonneville essentially is tapped out on resources.
Right, but we're putting in how many miles of pipe with steep drops.
Right, that's why I'm thinking, hey, here's a way, is this a way to generate something and generate some revenue?
Yeah, and put it all in at the same time
And-
too, and
and it
stop that
works.
going back and, yeah.
is that happening anywhere?
Yeah,
Here?
there's projects around. We have.
Micro projects, probably more.
Yeah, they're more like 25 kW, small ones, but with 24-inch pipe, there's probably quite a bit of energy in that water as it falls through the pipe.
Yeah,
And essentially, that's what a penstock is in a generator. It's just a bigger diameter.
And then with the wind turbine, we're displacing very expensive power.
Yeah, because if you look in the budget, part of the problem we have in the budget is Mark's increase in insurance was $67,000. Treatment plant chemicals were $40,000 and power was $10,000 just for the treatment plant.
Yeah.
And so those are, over $100,000 in increases that we have no control
But if your water system is generating your electrical,
Electricity, then
Right, then
we can
you're-
offset that.
you're offsetting your costs within that division.
Or if it's generating more, it can be sold to the electric system and then it's a revenue source.
And we can wheel it down PG's wire too.
Or actually, we can do it on low.
Sure, we're not real close.
Well, but that's one other reason why when we're replacing the
Underground.
transmission mains, we're
So
putting
power.
conduits in with
Yeah.
it, because at some point we could actually use those
Sure.
conduits for either fiber or for power.
And that new federal program would give us actual cash rebates on that, right?
Yeah,
As opposed to, used to be you had to have a tax bill to
right,
make
right.
that work,
It's
but
what,
now there's one for us.
yeah, because we were tax exempt and,
Yeah,
what you had to do third-party financing
right,
to get that. But now we
Now
can
we-
get it.
we
It's
get the-
direct financing, call it?
yeah, or direct pay. I think.
Direct pay,
Yeah.
something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's potential we can get the tax credits where before, as you know, municipal, we were tax exempt, we couldn't get them.
I guess fiber is the other part of the conversation we're not really having yet. That would be interesting to have.
And that's another reason for putting in the conduit along the transmission main, is because at some point we can get fiber directly to the treatment plant. So,
And you know, as we look to have this innovation center develop, we'll need fiber out there also, which doesn't currently. It doesn't currently extend, but fiber as its own, theoretically fiber. Its own division.
right, but Online Northwest was across the road from that.
Yeah, there's a lot of fiber out in that area. Yeah,
So,
to be built out, so hospital and Evergreen, and all those areas out there have fiber. So we can get there.
This is coming out of left field in regards to what you brought up.
Mhm.
We have resisted borrowing money for decades. We've also had some frank conversations saying if and when we need to, we need to.
Right.
Going back to your situation, there's nothing that keeps us from going borrow money
Well,
for those projects. I mean, to get back to your point.
yeah, I feel like I feel like it's just looking at what's happening with the cost of goods and the cost of everything. I mean, when James showed us, was it the slide with all the increase?
Oh, that was Chad.
That was Chad. But the increase of cost for everything, and you just look at what's happening, it'd be, I was talking to Trina today, it's like, if I decided that I was gonna start saving money to buy a house. And the house, was $400,000 and I just said, I'm only gonna pay cash for it. When I finally got that cash in the bank, the house would be $800,000. And it's the same with the bypass project that we saw and all those things. And so there's so many things that are on our list that are critical infrastructure, and also to your point, to stave off having maintenance and repair things. And we're trying to be so responsible and only pay for it as we go and as we save the money and do it in phases, but it's just getting so expensive every few years that it's put off that we're having to save twice the amount of money that we thought the project was going to cost. And so we're very fortunate to be an entity that's debt free, which is just amazing. I think the comment was like, we're 50 to 75% of other entities have debt, right, that are like us. But at some point, I think it has to come into the conversation, like.
And we have to remember, we also have another resource there too, and that's the electives.
Right, so some inner fund. kind of-
Which we've done before.
The dam project.
Well, in the treatment plant, we borrowed $12 million from electric to help pay for the treatment plant.
And it's cheaper to borrow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because, and the other thing that, the other advantage of doing it that way is, if we borrow out on the market, commission starts to lose its ability to set rates.
That's what Sam was saying
Yeah.
before, which I need to, we need to understand.
The other interesting thing is when the city built a sewer plant in the 80s and did those first cost studies, the rate came out. There's a lot of angst over it and stuff. But the reality is there's been enough margin on those rates that we built millions of dollars worth of surplus to do all this infrastructure repair that normally cities borrow money to do. Now, this is dreaming, but you know, so we beat our chest, say we have cheapest water rates
Right.
in the world. Well, guess what? Maybe it's time to, we have competitive water rates,
Right.
but maybe we need to have that rate be high enough that all these things we're talking about, the rate helps generate some of those things.
Well, and maybe it's more important to be looking at it from the resiliency and the infrastructure piece than it is
Absolutely.
from the lowest rate.
I think,
I think we need to probably park that logic and look at what the market is around us. And we know that, I mean, we are way out of market. I mean,
Yeah.
it's pathetic out of market.
But I think, from listening to the commission, it sounds more like I'm hearing it's more important to have a system that is reliable
That's the
And-
selling point. Yes.
and not as important to have the lowest rates.
Not anymore.
I think it's, like you said, more competitive. But I mean, ultimately, we're not talking about the lowest.
Competitive.
Is a system that can address the needs
Yeah.
of your community, right?
Right.
So,
Reliability is,
reliability and redundancy
Right.
and being able to come in and just plug right in and get to work, that's important.
like,
Case-
emergency
case operating.
planning is like a
Yeah.
huge
Yeah.
part of that. Of that, and that is I mean, that's that huge thing that is so expensive. It's like, it's hard to see how it's ever gonna be attainable, but. At some point we have to put a stake in the sand and say, this has to happen, and it's gonna cost money, and it's gonna be. People are gonna be paying that money that live here now that probably aren't gonna be the people that are gonna benefit
That's right.
from it down the road, but that infrastructure, in my opinion, has to. Has to come
It's gotta
on.
be state of the art, right?
It just has to be there. I mean, it has to be available. I mean. I don't know. Again, we spend our whole lives here talking about the big earthquake, but. We're not prepared.
No.
We have a lot of ideas about how to be prepared, but
Our second joint meeting with council will be all about emergency preparedness.
right. Good.
So one of the things that I wanna, it's not this commission's responsibility, but housing is an issue and it will continue to be an issue. And I just want to make sure that we're thoughtful about how we talk about rates and costs to, developers, homeowners, home renters, right? Like, we want to make sure, because I think if you asked businesses right now, the ability to find people, one of the number one issues is people can't find places to live.
Right.
So it is our responsibility to at least have that in consideration.
well, and going to your point is that,
Yes.
water and electric costs are part of your living expense,
Yes.
and part of that,
Yes.
and
Part of your housing expense.
part of your housing expense, and, I can say, my water, electric, sewer bill averages probably $120 a month. For a house here, and you go to PG and just the power bill alone.
Yeah.
Is double that, then you add water and sewer on top of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is, an incentive. And it does help.
The things I've liked that I really like are the self-generating, so the turbine idea. I think if the commission does entertain borrowing, I also really strongly lean into that internal borrowing as available, and it can even be to the benefit of the other division.
Right.
And I think that that's very strong. I think it's a good thing to entertain the expedited process. I also feel like we kind of need some more information on where we are in terms of comparative rates. I'd be happy to entertain those ideas about trying to reopen lines of communication for water sales if the commission is interested in that. And I hear your concern. And, I don't know if the commission generally is interested. I don't know if that's a conversation we want to pursue. And certainly don't need to waste anybody's time with it, but I'd be happy to test those waters. I have good relationships with the mayors of both Carlton and Dayton. And I would be interested in evaluating those third tier rates, not that I'm not that I think that that's an immediate solution, but as we look at, and we know we have some very large users, right? We talked about Cascade. We also have a water park in the city of McMinnville. Golf course was mentioned. We have a dairy. We have a lot of wineries and breweries that use a lot of water. So also just to say that in that I don't see that as a singular business that is suddenly be affected where all other industrial users would be left out of that. And that might be something where there might be an opportunity for impact that doesn't trickle into your month-to-month household income in the same way. Exactly.
And I think that it brings up, the importance of when people are paying for the water they're using at a fair rate compared to everybody else, or a fair amount compared to everybody else. I think it also brings people think more about what they're using. I mean, it leads to the conservatism of conserving water and thinking about it if you're actually paying for it. And I think it makes us better stewards of the water system to be thinking about it in that way.
And we've seen those effects, I think, in surrounding cities too, and other cities have evaluated and talked about their really high users. It's tended to curb the use of the highest users.
Yeah. And to go back to talk about other cities, I mean, I feel like there should already be, and I think there is, like with the committee that you're talking about,
Water,
the
yeah.
white.
There's a water station.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there should be a water discussion amongst all these cities, again, for like emergency planning and, and people run, I mean, for emergent, I mean, it feels like the more that we can be interconnected for when that time comes, and the more thought and preparation goes into that. I mean, what do you do when you're McMinnville and you're sitting here with 20 million gallons extra of water, and this town over here, all their wells have run dry and they have nothing? Are you gonna just be like, sorry, you didn't talk to it before, and sorry, nobody can, I mean, it's a discussion that's gonna happen at some point, and any preliminary work towards that, I think, is really important.
As I recall, we have a draft emergency water contract that Carlton hasn't responded to for a year, right?
It's been a while. Yeah,
So,
Yeah, so it's
They've
not
been
like
silent
we've
on
been
it.
trying, right?
yeah,
it's interesting because I think the smaller cities, they don't think about that because they have so many other things to worry about.
right.
It's so low
It's
on their list.
critical infrastructure.
No.
I mean,
Well, look at, Carlton's a good example. Look at how much money they got for grants to fix their system.
Yeah.
It was like 7.6 million or something just to fix their transmission main and some of the pipe in town, because they're not investing back into their system every year. They're, and their rates are already, 3 times ours. Because, they don't have the customer count to support what they're really doing.
They also don't have the resource to
Right.
access, not only to put in the infrastructure,
Right.
but even to hire the people to have the overall resource
Yeah.
of improving infrastructure. I went to, Merkley hosted a roundtable discussion that was entirely focused on water, and it was all the all the cities of Manitoba for us. It was all of us, and so I wouldn't say that they're not thinking about it, but they're like,
They don't have the
there are many
resource
that are
to
like,
do it.
yeah, we don't have the resource to do it. Willamina does not have the resource
yeah.
to invest in public water infrastructure.
Yeah, and I know for my business, we would have never done anything that we did if we couldn't have done the labor in-house. Like if we had had to
Right.
contract everything out,
Yeah.
nothing would have ever,
Yeah.
we would have never built anything.
And that's the problem that a lot of cities that have water systems have, is they don't do anything in-house. It's all contracted out, which makes it even more expensive.
Yeah.
And that's an advantage we have.
Huge.
Yeah. And so we definitely need to keep that skill set and grow that skill
Oh, yeah.
set and have our employees doing that.
Can we? I mean, can we grow and be that. I don't know, could we be that resource for other cities? Like, could we?
Do you think that goes beyond the scope of water and light? I mean, not to be a willing
No.
participant in it, but it's a much different thing to say,
Yeah.
leadership, we need this, as opposed to say water and light or the city saying, we are going to be the regional collaborator because we have the biggest resource. That's.
That's where we're at as a collaborative.
The only thing I would say is that in an emergency situation,
That's,
that,
all bets are off there. We're gonna do
right,
whatever
that
we need to.
water
We've done
light
that.
would be a lead in that, so
Yeah.
to lay some groundwork in that area. If emergency management and emergency response is part of our mission and part of our goals, then we are not going to be an island. And there will be a lot of mutual aid agreements in place, and the pressure on this organization would be extraordinary.
We have those mutual aid agreements in place now. We have one with Forewarn, which is the Oregon Water Group, Water and Wastewater Group. We have one with BPA, and we have one, the APPA agreement too, for power. So we have those mutual aid agreements in place.
Jody, what do we do with, say, we have a city where we we've talked to them, we spent a bunch of money on attorneys. We sent them a draft agreement on this and they won't even respond on emergency water.
I'm not sure what I think there's always two sides.
Well, I'm
So,
sure they have.
and
Yeah.
But they won't even tell us their side.
Big organization. Well, it's likely capacity. There's probably a mayor who's engaged in the work in some way. It's political and some, it's,
So what should we do though?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure what the situation is. I'm not sure. I'm just saying in an emergency.
Mhm.
And you're saying that you're trying to lay the groundwork in case there's an emergency.
Which is
right?
what you suggested.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's more than just setting there's more to it, right?
So when we checked, when you and I had checked on the Orward, I think most of the cities in the Anthill County were not part of the mutual aid
Oh, my gosh.
So,
group.
yeah, and even if, we work with other utilities in other cities that have, if they needed something, we would assist them, like we
Yes,
have
of
a
course.
valve, if they meeting plan for something like that, and they don't have it on stock. We loan it out and they return, give us something new back, but, we work with them, we have connections out on the operations side of things. You're talking about the big emergencies.
Yeah.
But we have agreements and we reached out to these communities. And like John was saying, a lot of them just haven't followed through on the other end.
Maybe it's not Water and Light that's a part. Maybe it's led by another organization. I don't know. But we
Cheryl,
don't-
Well, I would think county would be the one that. But,
Well, because they would be the EOC. If there's an emergency, they would be the operator of that. And they would be the convener for that. So, yeah, I mean, maybe that's where it lies in the bigger.
So anecdotally, over the years, unbeknownst to the commission. And unbeknownst sometimes to management at Water and Light, the relationships that our water guys had with the water guys of other cities. Over the years, there was a hose more than once drug from the window, Water and Light to Carlton when Raymond Rake was alive and stuff. It doesn't happen now, but there's just, they're doing a lot of, the employees took care of the moves. Yeah, but we're even talking to Dundee. That's how much effort we've made.
All right,
Okay.
all right.
So
great.
I guess-
Additional, yeah.
Our staffs. Trina's gonna. Get all the questions together and we'll see about trying to get all the answers and then we'll get back with the commission with those questions.
Yeah, sounds
So-
great. Thank you. Great work session, everybody. Thanks so much for your time and have a great evening. We'll call the meeting to
And it's very nice
And-
of you.
adjournment.